Hey, welcome back to the Schwobo Studio at Columbus State University's Schwob School of Music. We are continuing with our scraping process. So yesterday we put a little bit more in our blank scrape for our tip and then put our long channels into the reed and got the reed to a point where it would be good to let it sit overnight. And so today we're going to touch all that up just a little bit and give it a clip and see where we are. So our goal is to get the reed clipped open and get it to a point where it's vibrating really well without putting back in just yet. We're going to do that tomorrow, but get it to another point where it's going to be good to let it sit and rest for one more night till we put some back in tomorrow. So we'll come on over to the reed desk, and I'm just going to give my knives a really quick little sharpen on my burnishing rod to make sure that they're super sharp. I almost always have at least two knives kind of going at the same time, just to make sure that I always have the sharpest equipment possible. So we're going to grab our little reed, and still looking okay. Little reed goblins didn't come and do too much damage overnight. I can still see my pencil for my armpits marked there, so I don't need to put those back in. And I'm just looking at the profile to see how much cane grew overnight. So I'm just going to lightly touch up everything that we scraped yesterday, and then we're going to give it a dunk in our water and clip it open and see how easily or not we might be vibrating. So I'm going to take a couple more just long scrapes in my channel. So you notice my scrapes are a little bit shorter than they were yesterday, but I'm still moving really in the same way. I'm moving more from my left hand than I am from the right, keeping the blade of the knife still pretty much perpendicular to the cane and letting the cane roll off the reed. So you don't want to do too much here, especially in the heart, but I just like to make sure the reed isn't going to feel like two popsicle sticks when I clip it open. So I'm going to come back to the tip and just get a little bit more out here. The reed is almost open on its own. We've done so much at the outer tip, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But we're going to encourage it to fully open in just a second. Keeping my knife pressure really light. If you do that, you can actually feel kind of bumps along the way, and you can smooth those out. I'm just going to catch that little point at the tip there. So before I clip it open, I'm just going to give my reed a quick dunk in the water, and then make a little space here for me to clip my reed open. So most people clip this way. So most people clip this way with the tip of the reed pointing away from them, and they guillotine the reed here. I actually do the opposite. I flip the tip of the reed towards myself. I find that I can see what I'm clipping off a little bit easier. Gosh, the tip of that reed looks terrible. I almost want to take it all off there. So I'm going to clip off. My reed is a little bit rounded at the tip, so I'm actually going to take a little more off than I normally would, just to get the tip of the reed a little bit straighter across. And it's making a little bit of vibration, but it's pretty tough. So I need to address first the very outer tip, because it doesn't really matter how much we've scraped the outer tip in our blank scrape. When you clip it open, there's going to be a ka-chunk, and I'll kind of show you what I mean by what we call the ka-chunk here in the Schwobo Studio. When you scrape at the very tip of the reed and you let the knife come off on the plaque, you hear that sound on the plaque. We call that the ka-chunk. So we always try to get rid of the ka-chunk first, because you don't really know how the reed is vibrating if it has that speed bump at the outer tip. So it's pretty thick on this side. So I'm just like a 0.5 millimeter at the outer tip. I'm just using that much of the tip to get rid of the ka-chunk. I don't want to come back too much more because then I'll start to take out my spine in the middle of the tip. So there, that's a little bit better. So now, I always like to check that my reed is sealing also at this point once I've clipped it open. Now I'm kind of looking at my aperture. What I'm looking for is a diamond shape, and we'll show you that in just a minute. And then I also remember I like to look at my profiles. So I'm pulling out a reed that, it's not the same one as yesterday, but it's in the same place as the one that I was working on yesterday. And I'm going to just clean up a little bit what we already did yesterday. So I'm going to take a few more long scrapes in the tip. My scrapes are a little bit shorter, but notice I'm still doing most of the movement of the reed with the left hand and not the right, and I'm still keeping my knife blade pretty much perpendicular to the surface of the cane. So that feels a little bit better. My pencil marks are still on the side of my reed where my armpits need to be. I'm just going to do a little bit more kind of on the side by the armpit, and then like the top half on each corner, and then just a little bit at the outer tip. And the same thing on this side, and then we will clip this open and see what we got. Okay. So I like what I'm seeing in the profile. I think it's got a really nice taper to the outer tip. So I'm just going to give it a quick dunk in the water and clip. Most people clip with the reed pointing this way. I like to clip with the reed pointing towards me because I can see better what I'm actually clipping off. So oftentimes when you go to clip the reed for the first time, it's not straight across. I don't want to take a lot off the tip, but I do want to take a little bit off, enough to sort of get the tip of the reed more straight across than rounded. So it's not perfect yet, but we got a long way to go. This is a really long tip on the reed, and that will get thinned and clipped some more, so I'm not too worried about if it's not perfect just yet. So oftentimes I'll close up the bottom of the reed and then just draw air through it, and you should hear that pop, and that's letting you know that the reed is sealing, which is really important. We talked about that in our tying phase. So from here, I'm gonna now put my plaque in. And so just a note about the plaque, put it in until you feel the sides of the reed grab the plaque. You don't want to put it in all the way because you're going to start to force the blades of the reed open, and then your reed won't seal anymore. So just put it in enough. We're going to be working more in the tip, so I need it to at least support where the armpits are and then the rest of the tip, so I don't need it to come all the way down into the back. I never push my plaque in that far anyways. So I'm going to come back and measure where my armpits are. Because really, once that pencil goes away, you want to put it back in because you want your armpits to stay at 66. If you don't continue to put that pencil back on, you'll either end up with armpits at 68 or armpits somewhere way, way, way lower. And that's one thing that you have control over, that you can keep consistent in your reed making. So I strongly suggest that you do that. I'm going to come to this knife, but I'm going to give it a little sharpen here. So I'm really going to do the same thing that I did yesterday as far as that scraping in the tip with the metered scrape. So I'm thinking about my angle away from the spine, and I'm thinking about the angle of my peak. And I'm going to start with just a couple little scrapes in my armpit, just because it's kind of thick back there. And then I'm going to follow through. So I've got that kind of diagonal off the corner scrape, and I start a millimeter higher, millimeter higher, 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 higher. All of those off the outer tip. I'm going to come over here, clear out that armpit just a little bit. It's a little thicker on that side. And then metered scrape. And I still feel just a little ka-chunk out there, so just going to do a tiny bit of dusting sort of in that outer 1/2 millimeter of the tip to ensure that we don't have the ka-chunk there. So I'm flipping the reed over to catch this other blade. And then I'm going to take those long scrapes, each starting closer to the outer tip. And you can hear that ka-chunk. It's just that little bit of speed bump at the outer tip. Okay, so we're looking pretty good. We're going to try to catch a shot of the aperture here so you can see what we're going for. So when I close the reed, I want to start to see diamond shape. I want the sides of the reed to collapse first, and because we're looking to keep spine through the tip, the middle of the tip holds up. So we're starting to sort of kind of get that diamond shape, but we still have a lot more work to go in the tip and the rest of the reed. So as we proceed, we should start to see even more diamond shapes start to appear in our aperture. So I'm happy with that, right? I wouldn't want to play the Strauss Concerto on this reed just yet, but it's vibrating. I like the way our profile is looking, and I like the shape our aperture is starting to take. So I'm going to do just a little bit more. I'm going to take a couple more long scrapes to balance out the work that I just did in the tip, and then I'll probably do just a little bit more in the tip. I want the reed to get to a point where it's vibrating pretty well and fairly easily, and be pretty close to a C in our crow. A high B is okay also at this point for me. So I'm going to scrape us a little bit more to see if we can get to that point. And we're back. So I just did some more thinning of the long channels and in the tip itself, and if we want to check in, oh, that's looking much better. So a little check in with our profile. Good. So some really nice taper going all the way through the heart to the outer tip, so I really like that. And now come to our aperture. And starting to look more like a diamond. So it's collapsing much easier from the sides of the tip. So we are going in the right direction. So let's see where our crow is. So it's kind of B flat, B territory, but I feel like we're vibrating easy enough that we can give this a little clip or two. Before I clip a reed, regardless of where the pitch is, I always make sure that the aperture is under control. If the aperture is open and you clip the reed, it's going to make it worse, and you might actually drop the pitch even further because your aperture is getting bigger. So I want to make sure that the aperture and the response are both in the right place before clipping. So I think we're in good shape here. So I'm going to take a tiny little clip. So I always take the smallest clip possible, maybe with the exception of that very first clip to open up the reed, because a little goes a really long way. So you never know. John Mack used to say, you never know when you've clipped past the perfect reed. So you take small little clips. So I don't know if you can see that almost little hair of a piece of cane. That's what I just clipped off. Oh. And that made quite a difference in the pitch of my crow. I feel like the response is still okay, so I'm going to try one more. One thing to note, I always put the overlap side of my reed facing up when I clip. That way I know that I always want to put that down towards my bottom lip, because even if you're not intending to, oftentimes the blade that's on the top when you clip ends up being just slightly shorter than the other one. And so you want that shorter blade to your bottom lip because that will make your response a little bit better. All right, that helped. I'm going to take one more, and then I'm going to actually try it in the instrument and see what it feels like there. So one more little clip. And I'm obsessed with the aperture, so I always look at the aperture again. Still looking good. So it's kind of fluctuating between that B and that C. I just want to see what it feels like in the instrument. So it's a little bit stuffy, but the pitch is holding up, and I checked the upper register because that's really important that the upper register isn't really saggy in pitch. And so because it's a little bit stuffy and a little more resistant than I would like, I'm actually going to take just a little bit more off of our tip and make sure that I don't have a ka-chunk out there, because I just clipped it, 3 or 4 times, and you almost always have a ka-chunk when you've clipped your reed. And then hopefully we will be in a good place to let it rest overnight, one more night. My pencil's gone, so I've got to put my 66 armpits here back in. So I've been making reeds longer than I care to remember, and I still constantly come back to my pencil and my ruler, because that's one thing I can have absolute control over, so might as well take advantage. So again, I always kind of come back to my little armpit and clear out there, and then I turn the knife a little more diagonally, and I'm lightly just dusting through that outer corner. Just did a little bit over there, so let me come on this side. And then checking my ka-chunk over here. Yep, you can hear it. So the tip looks like it's really thin, but because I clipped it, there's just that little speed bump. All right, let me flip to the side. So when you scrape, you really want to scrape slowly and mindfully and pay close attention, because then you notice more and you can fix more, and you'll be less likely to scrape in places that don't need it and will actually make the reed worse. So always really pay close attention to what you're doing and have a reason for what you're doing. So don't just scrape because you have a knife in one hand and a reed in the other. Know why you're about to scrape in whatever part of the reed you're going to scrape in. And of course, crowing and playing the reed are really important to know what to do. All right, aperture is looking good. I might have to give it another clip before I put it away, but the response is much easier. So I want to at least get this into the B neighborhood. That's pretty good. I'm going to do one more little one. And I'll show you our aperture in just a second here. We're going to try it in the oboe. I suspect the upper register is going to be a little bit low. And I was correct. So I am going to take one more clip. Just a little one. That's better. And that actually cleared away a little bit of that stuffy response. So I'm not necessarily looking for lows in my crow yet because I haven't done anything in the back, but this is kind of where I would leave the reed. Let's check in with our profile and with our aperture.
Yep.
So everything is in good shape. So I feel okay about letting this reed rest overnight. So I think it's a good idea to let reeds kind of recover after you've done a lot to them. And what we did today is a fair amount of scraping and kind of trauma that this reed has gone through today. So it needs a little time to dry out and rebound. And so we'll check back in with it tomorrow and see what we get. But our hope tomorrow is to put some back in and do a little more finishing on the tip and then be fairly close to a finished reed. So we will see you back here tomorrow.